you look at the issue of global warming. Lots of really highly salient issues. You see these same paradoxes coming up. So what's going on here? There's two likely possibilities. One is that people are just morons. They don't know anything. They're ignorant, they're stupid, and they can't hold a coherent idea in their head. Another possibility, and I like this one more because I think it's a little bit more optimistic, is that people are very rational and they're confused. Yes, we take a look at these polls. They're holding simultaneously conflicting ideas at the same time. But actually this is really predictable. And it's a really reasonable expectation that this would happen when you have a political system and a media system which pride themselves on spin and propaganda. So people become very confused when they're systematically exposed to messages that are distorted and propagandistic. So if you take a look at democratic theory, there's a lot of social scientists who've looked at this, and they've actually charted it empirically. They show public opinion is not random. Public opinion is very stable. When you look at the same policy question month after month, year after year, it's very stable. It doesn't go up and down. It usually stays very much the same. When there is change, it's very incremental change within a couple percentage points, maybe a month at most. And usually, and people have shown this, when there is change, people are responding to something actually going on in the real world. Some sort of real event is happening, and people are responding to it and changing their opinion. So public opinion changes incrementally. So I want to look at these real-world events. What's going on in the real world where public opinion is changing and becoming more confused? And that's the idea behind this concept of the more you watch, the less you know. That you have a system that's increasingly dominated by conservative points of view, pro-business points of view. You have a media-induced ignorance. And it's usually related to a crisis culture, which is what I call it. Every one of these issues is a crisis. You have public opinion on many of these issues comes into a debate on such an issue like healthcare reform, pretty progressive. By 2003, it was something like 60 to 65% of Americans said they wanted universal healthcare, not just a public option. And yet, by the end of this debate, by late 2009, early 2010, people were barely supportive, a majority of a public option, and a majority now said that they opposed any kind of reforms. It's always a crisis. We hear about death panels. Does Barack Obama want to kill your grandmother? That was the dominant debate in late 2009. Iraq has weapons of mass destruction and wants to kill Americans. Same thing with Iran. Global warming. If we do anything about increasing carbon emissions, our economy will be destroyed. Every single one of these issues where you can actually chart people who pay more attention to media are more likely to be ignorant on these issues or harbor racist opinions in the case of Islam. You find this kind of relationship. It's a crisis culture and it's based upon media consumption. So that's what I want to talk about today. In terms of this issue of Islam, this really shouldn't surprise anybody that we have a media culture that is fundamentally racist. This goes back to Edward Said, who talked about Orientalism, this whole idea of a political culture and a media culture which fuses these separate ideas that I talked about in separate things like Islam as a religion, Arabic as a language, brown is a skin color. This is a classic example of this is Barack Obama. Barack Obama is all bad things when you look at people on the right, when you look at these boogeyman arguments. He is the black, foreign, Kenyan, Muslim, terrorist other. It's all thrown together into one big smorgasbord. He is the socialist threat. Put them all together. And it's no surprise that when you take a look at some of these issues, he's being increasingly confused with, such as his advocacy for basic First Amendment rights in regards to building a Muslim community center in Manhattan. It's no surprise, if you look closely at the polls, that people are actually reacting to this, and they're going along, a lot of people at least, with these birther conspiracies and these ideas that Obama is a Muslim, and they're linking him to this basic idea, which is, oh, I support basic First Amendment rights for people to build a community center. And it's actually been charted, as we've recently seen. If you take a close look at public opinion polls, Pew Research Center, they've shown a dramatic increase within the last year of people who think that Obama is a Muslim, he's some sort of Kenyan foreigner. And it's happening right at the same time that he's arguing in favor of basic First Amendment for Muslims. There's this kind of conflation going on. Why is this a problem? Well, turn on Fox News, or in my case, go get the transcripts online from LexisNexis, because I refuse on general principle to pay for their Nielsen ratings. But you'll see that this whole controversy about this Muslim community center is manufactured. First of all, it's not a mosque. This is the way it's been reported. It's a mosque at ground zero. It's not a mosque, it's a Muslim community center. It has a prayer area. It's not on ground zero. Number 2, it's been called the Ground Zero Mosque, which is problematic if it's not a mosque and it's not on ground zero. So it's blocks away from ground zero. It's nearby. And supposedly the people who are supporting it, such as Abdul Rauf, is a terrorist because he refuses to get into a debate about whether groups like Hamas are terrorist or not. He says explicitly that I don't want to get into those issues. I believe in bridging divides. I don't want to talk about controversial political issues. According to Sean Hannity of Fox News, this proves not only that he's a defender of Hamas, but that he supports bin Laden and 9/11 terrorist attacks. So this has been the extrapolation that has come about. Now, if you actually take a look at what this gentleman says, it's the exact opposite. He said that bin Laden and Islamist fundamentalists do not represent the foundation of Islam. He said that very clearly. He said the exact opposite of what's been attributed to him. When he talked about blood on American hands in the wake of 9/11, he was specifically talking about U.S. support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, of which Osama bin Laden was a member. So contrary to this propaganda from Sean Hannity and others, excuse me, he was saying, and he was speaking critically of Osama bin Laden and what the U.S. did. And he said, you shouldn't support people like this. He wasn't supporting, he was saying the exact opposite. Now, if you take a closer look at a lot of what was happening in right-wing radio and Fox, you saw basically the same kind of fear-mongering. You saw Newt Gingrich, I don't know if people remember these quotes, they're worth revisiting very quickly. There should be no mosque near ground zero so long as there's no churches in Saudi Arabia. Which is an interesting commentary, because apparently Islam is monolithic. He picked one of the most extreme countries when you talk about Islamism and Islamic fundamentalism, and he assumed that all of Islam can be traced back to this one interpretation, which, by the way, he supported in Congress when he was in power in the 1990s. The United States government has very strong relations with Saudi Arabia. That didn't come up in the discussion, that he's more directly responsible for propping up that regime than anybody that he's talking about, which there's no connection. But Islam is monolithic. Why pick Saudi Arabia? Why not pick Indonesia? Indonesia is a secular Muslim country. It's the largest Muslim country. They've even had a female president. We can't even boast that in this country. So it's interesting to see the examples that are chosen and what it reveals about the biases of the people who chose them. Sarah Palin framed the decision to have a Muslim community center as an unnecessary provocation. So in other words, everybody in the Muslim community is provoking Americans and the American public, because we know there's no difference between people engaged in the 9/11 terrorist attacks and all the rest of the American Muslim community, which, by the way, is overwhelmingly secular in terms of the division between church and state, and opposed to terrorist attacks. Rush Limbaugh said, and I'm quoting, "What if the KKK tried to establish a memorial at Gettysburg?" That was his analogy. So now the American Muslim community is the equivalent of the KKK in lynching African Americans in the South. Gingrich came back again, not to be outdone. He's got to beat the KKK quote. He said, Nazis don't have the right to put up a sign next to the Holocaust Museum. So now we've come full circle here. We have now the Muslim American community are Nazis, guilty of Holocaust-like violence. So that's interesting when you take a look at this report. Now, we would say, well, big surprise. People at Fox News are a bunch of racists, and they like to stoke public fear. It wasn't that much better in the straight, quote-unquote, objective reporting. If you take a look at the New York Times and the Washington Post this month, as I have, you will find that stories including the words ground zero and mosque showed up 53 times in the last 27 days. Compared to the term Muslim Community Center, which showed up 11 times. So the Washington Post had 53 stories on ground zero mosque and 11 stories on the Muslim Community Center. That's a 5-to-1 imbalance, basically appropriating this conservative framework. It was about the same for the New York Times. They had about 56 stories on ground zero on the mosque and about 22 on Muslim Community Center. So we can find many examples of this. If we go back in media coverage, I've written about quite a few of them. We can take a look at the Fort Hood fallout. I'm not going to go into an extreme amount of detail, although I have written on it if you take a look on it online. For some reason, Islam was inherently linked to terrorism when you talk about the coverage, as compared to events where Christians who engage in violence, in this case against an abortion doctor, George Tiller, the individual